A watch, frozen at the exact moment of betrayal, becomes the only witness to a crime. Welcome to Revenge Oath. I'm your host, Conan Doyle. Tell me, what do you think that broken timepiece is trying to reveal? Stay close. The truth awaits. It was in the chill of a late November morning that the case first presented itself. Not as a thunderclap of alarm, but as a curious rapping at the door of our Baker Street lodgings. The fire had only just been lit, and I was buried to the nose in the morning papers, scanning reports of minor larcenies and industrial squabbles, none of which, I assumed, would pique the interest of my friend and flatmate, Sherlock Holmes. He was in one of his more pensive moods that morning, sprawled lengthwise across the sofa in his favorite dressing gown, eyes closed, fingers steepled, and the distinct scent of pipe tobacco still lingering in the air from his recent contemplations. To the casual observer, he might have appeared to be asleep, but I'd lived long enough at 221B to know that this was the posture of a mind in swift and silent operation. Someone of considerable wealth and habitually late, Holmes murmured without opening his eyes. I looked up, startled, and turned toward the door just as Mrs. Hudson ushered in our morning visitor. A woman of striking composure, dressed in deep navy with fine kid gloves and a feathered hat of a fashion some years behind the trend, but of unmistakable quality. Her bearing was calm but not indifferent, and though she greeted us with practiced politeness, there was a tightness to her lips that bespoke deeper tensions. "Mr. Holmes," she said with a gentle dip of the head, "my name is Lady Adelia Warringham. I believe I'm in desperate need of your assistance." Holmes opened his eyes, sat up at once, and gestured to the armchair across from him. "Please, Lady Warringham, sit. Your carriage arrived 10 minutes late, and the delay has clearly disturbed your usual rhythm." She blinked in confusion. "How could you possibly—" Holmes waved a hand with impatience. "The silk trim on your glove is damp and smudged with soot. Belgravia fog at this hour means only one thing. Your driver took the Thames embankment route, which is more scenic but predictably congested. The second button on your coat is done in haste, something you would not have permitted had your timing been precise. May I offer tea, or would you prefer we proceed to the matter which brought you here?" Lady Warringham nodded slowly, now visibly unnerved, but her voice remained steady. "It is my husband, Lord Percival Warringham. He was found dead in his study at Warringham House just before midnight. Scotland Yard believes it was a suicide, but I am not convinced." Holmes' eyes glinted with a sudden keenness. "Not convinced?" "It was the watch," she said, fingers clenching in her lap. "His pocket watch. It had stopped at precisely 10:43 p.m., and I swear to you, Mr. Holmes, he always wound it before retiring. It was his ritual. He said no gentleman should enter sleep or society untethered from time." "A curious sentiment," Holmes murmured. "And yet the constables took it merely as coincidence." "Worse?" Lady Warringham replied, her voice dropping. "They dismissed it entirely. But that time, 10:43, does not align with when his valet claims to have heard the fatal shot. There is something wrong, Mr. Holmes. I feel it." For a moment, Holmes was still. Then he rose and stepped to the window, hands clasped behind his back. "A watch that stops not from accident, but perhaps by arrangement. A study death presumed to be suicide, and a widow, pardon me, who does not weep." "You are correct to be uneasy, Lady Warringham. Watson, have you ever observed how timepieces often tell the truth more precisely than men?" "I have not," I replied. Holmes turned, his smile faint but sharp. "Then let us see what story this particular watch may tell." He rang for his coat and hat. "Come, Watson, the game, it seems, is not only afoot, but quite determined to deceive." The cab ride to Warringham House was undertaken in silence, save for the soft creak of leather and the rhythmic clatter of wheels upon damp cobbles. Holmes stared fixedly through the fogged glass, eyes narrowed in thought, while I busied myself recalling the particulars Lady Warringham had offered. The death of a peer, a timepiece stopped at a moment inconsistent with witness statements, and a widow who believed in her husband's predictability more than Scotland Yard did. These alone might not constitute a mystery. But in Holmes' world, no anomaly was too slight. The Warringham estate lay nestled in the distinguished shadow of Hyde Park, a broad-faced stone building that wore its age well. Its tall windows, ironwork balconies, and well-tended hedgerows bespoke a history of discreet wealth and an aversion to vulgar display. A uniformed constable stood at the gates but offered no resistance once Holmes presented his card. Inside, the air was heavy with the unmistakable hush of recent death. The household staff moved like shadows, speaking in whispers and glancing anxiously over shoulders. We were met by Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard, whose expression tightened upon seeing Holmes. "I expected you'd turn up eventually," Lestrade said with forced cheerfulness. "And brought the good doctor too, I see. Well, you're late to the scene, Holmes. We've already concluded it. A straightforward suicide. Pistol to the head, door locked from the inside, no sign of struggle." Holmes removed his gloves with an absent air. "And the motive?" Lestrade shrugged. "Financial difficulties. Lord Warringham had made a string of poor investments. Took it harder than most. No note, but his manservant swears he's been depressed of late. Yet I am told his watch stopped at a time inconsistent with the shot being heard," Holmes said coolly. Lestrade hesitated. "That's not exactly a clue, Holmes. The mainspring might have broken from the fall, and what if it stopped earlier? He could have removed it before pulling the trigger. You're grasping." "I never grasp," Holmes replied, brushing past him. The study had been sealed by a yard man, but Lestrade produced the key with reluctance. The room was as one might expect of a peer who valued order and tradition. Walls of dark oak, a fireplace still faintly warm, and a stately desk facing a pair of tall windows. Lord Warringham's body had already been removed, but the blood stain on the Aubusson carpet remained, a grim blossom that marked the fatal spot. Holmes moved immediately to the desk, then to the small glass case nearby containing a modest collection of antique timepieces. His fingers hovered over the shelf before settling on a gap between two stands. "Curious," he murmured. "Lady Warringham mentioned only one watch, but her husband owned several. This gap, do you see it, Watson? One piece is clearly missing." I nodded, noting the faint ring of undisturbed dust. "Do you suppose the missing timepiece is the one that stopped?" "Precisely, and it has not been returned to its rightful place." He turned sharply to Lestrade. Was the watch not catalogued with the effects? Lestrade consulted a small notebook. A gold pocket watch was found in his hand. "Broken, as I said." "Describe it." "Standard fare. Chain snapped. Initials PW on the back." Holmes moved swiftly across the room and knelt beside the fireplace, brushing the tiles lightly with his fingers. Then, reaching for the poker, he stirred the cold ash. After a few moments, he retrieved something metallic, bent, scorched, and still vaguely circular. "A second timepiece," he said triumphantly. "Burnt, but unmistakably a watch. No initials, no chain. Why destroy it unless it bore an inconvenient truth?" Lestrade frowned. "You think someone burned the real watch and planted a substitute?" "I do not think. I observe. And it is elementary that if a watch stops at 10:43 and is subsequently destroyed, while another is placed in the hand of the deceased, then we are dealing with a deliberate manipulation. The hand of suicide does not concern itself with temporal inconsistencies." He stepped back and surveyed the room in full. "There is more," he said. "Look here. Watson, what do you make of this mark upon the floor beneath the window?" I bent to inspect it. "A scratch, fairly shallow. Recent." "More than a scratch," Holmes said. "That, Watson, is the mark left by a boot. Leather dragged across polished wood in haste. And here, note the faint smear upon the drapery edge. A man stood there not long ago, hiding or perhaps listening." Lestrade leaned in. You're suggesting someone was in the room? Holmes turned sharply. I'm suggesting the room was not sealed at the time of the shot, and that the scenario you have accepted is far too tidy. Tell me, was the pistol recovered from the right hand? Yes, it was. Then we must also consider this. Lord Warringham was left-handed. Lestrade's mouth parted in surprise, and I felt a thrill of unease run up my spine. Lady Warringham confirmed it this morning, Holmes continued. And if he held the weapon in his weaker hand, we are forced to ask, was he drugged, forced, or was the entire scene arranged post-mortem? Holmes crossed the room again and opened the desk drawer. Inside was a scattering of correspondence, a ledger, and a small black notebook. He flipped through its pages with sharp, practiced fingers, then handed it to me. Read aloud the last entry. I did so. 11 a.m. are to arrive. No more delays. Must end it tonight or everything falls. Lestrade cursed. That could be Robert Claythorne, his cousin. Bit of a black sheep. Rumors of debts. He showed up here 2 days ago asking for money. Then we must speak to Mr. Claythorne at once, Holmes said, and examine his shoes. Lestrade blinked. His shoes? Holmes gave a faint smile. To match the scratch, of course. But more than that, I wish to know what else stopped at 10:43 that evening. Not merely a watch, but perhaps an arrangement, a betrayal, something our deceased peer expected and received differently than he imagined. As we exited the study, Holmes paused in the doorway and glanced back at the scorched watch fragment still lying cold in the ash. There is a story buried here, Watson. One of deception, misdirection, and most likely murder. And it began the moment someone stopped that watch and hoped time would not betray them. We followed Lestrade down the corridor, the first threads of a tangled truth already winding their way into Holmes's mind, where no secret could stay hidden long. The drawing room to which we were led for our conversation with Robert Claythorne was lavish in design, but sparse in warmth. Heavy, crimson drapes muffled the afternoon light, and a grandfather clock ticked solemnly in the corner, its chimes conspicuously absent at the hour. The air held a stiffness that no hearth could quite warm, and the man who occupied the chair near the brandy decanter struck me as similarly cold. Robert Claythorne bore little resemblance to his late cousin. Where Lord Warringham had been widely regarded as austere but principled, Claythorne gave the impression of having once been handsome but softened too much by drink and indolence. His hair was disheveled, his waistcoat buttoned askew, and though he made a show of rising to greet us, his greeting was unconvincing. "Well then," he drawled, slumping back down, "I suppose you've come to question the errant relative. Everyone seems to think I'm either mad or murderous." "We are merely interested in the truth, Mr. Claythorne," Holmes replied, settling into a nearby chair with his usual languid grace. "Doctor, Watson and I are assisting Inspector Lestrade in clarifying certain inconsistencies in Lord Warringham's passing." Claythorne snorted, reaching for the brandy. "You'll find no shortage of those in this house, Mr. Holmes. My cousin kept more secrets than cigars." Holmes' gaze sharpened. "Including a scheduled meeting with someone identified only as R." Claythorne froze, the glass halfway to his lips. "You seem acquainted with the name," Holmes continued, "though not, perhaps, with the implication of being recorded in a personal notebook as the last engagement of a man now deceased." "I don't deny I was here that night," Claythorne said slowly, lowering the glass. "Percival summoned me, said it was urgent, wanted to talk about a trust, family property and such. He was acting strangely, very intense. I thought it might be about the debt I owe him, but he brushed it off. Said he had more important matters. I left before 9. And yet the shot was heard nearer midnight," Holmes replied. "You had 3 hours unaccounted for." Claythorne stiffened. "I went to the Lennox Club after. Asked the steward. I was seen." "I shall," Holmes said simply. "But your cousin's watch, broken and supposedly stopped at 10:43, was not the one found in the fireplace. There were two, Mr. Claythorne. One planted to suit a story, and another burned to erase it. Claythorne's expression flickered, and in that flicker I saw it. Something between doubt and fear. He glanced toward the clock as though seeking confirmation of a time already past. "You think I did this?" he said, his voice low. "You think I'd kill Percival over money? He was the last family I had." "That remains to be established," Holmes said, rising. "But before we leave, I must trouble you to remove your shoes." What kind of absurd? Humor me." With visible irritation, Claythorne obliged. Holmes knelt, examining the soles with a magnifying lens he produced from his pocket. After a moment, he grunted softly. "Do you possess another pair?" he asked without looking up. "Perhaps leather-soled with a slight notch in the left heel?" Claythorne hesitated. "I might." "Yes, upstairs." "We shall need them. Lestrade, please ensure they are obtained." Claythorne's bravado had thinned palpably, and though he said nothing further, I noticed that he gripped the arms of his chair with whitening knuckles. Holmes made a final cursory sweep of the room before motioning for us to withdraw. Outside in the corridor, Lestrade's brow was furrowed deeply. "Do you truly think it was him?" he asked. "Claythorne's no saint but murder. It feels too heavy-handed." "He is not our man," Holmes replied at once. "Not directly." "Then why?" "He lies, certainly, but not about the murder. His club will confirm his alibi, though I suspect he left earlier than he claims and returned here for some clandestine purpose. Nevertheless, his shoes do not match the mark near the study window, and more importantly, he was expected. It is the person who arrived unexpectedly we must now identify." Holmes paused by a narrow hall that branched toward the servants' quarters. "Let us speak with the valet," he said. "The last person to see Lord Warringham alive may have heard more than he realizes." The man in question, one Frederick Grimes, was a lean, tight-lipped fellow with the weary composure of long service. His room was modest, his speech clipped, and though clearly shaken by his master's death, he remained precise in his recollections. "I brought his tea at 10, Grimes said, hands folded before him. "He was alone, dismissed me promptly. I heard nothing until near midnight, what I thought was a shot. I ran to the door, but it was locked. I fetched the butler, and we forced it." "And during that time," Holmes asked, "did anyone else approach the study? Did you hear voices? Footsteps?" "No, sir. None that I noticed. But there is a secondary staircase near the east wing, is there not?" Grimes blinked. "Yes, rarely used. I would like to see it." The staircase, when we were shown to it, was narrow and enclosed behind a paneled door, easily mistaken for part of the wall. It led from the ground floor to a corridor not far from the study and, crucially, could have allowed movement unseen by the main staff. Holmes ran a finger along the banister and paused. "Dust disturbed," he said quietly. "And recent." He turned suddenly, sharp as a foxhound catching a scent. "Watson, remember the letter we saw in the desk drawer? The other correspondence?" "Yes. Most were dull. Ledgers, notes, nothing that stood out. But one was addressed to A. Mortimer at an unfamiliar address in Mayfair." I frowned. "Do you think this Mortimer could be—" "Not just a correspondent, Watson. A player. Someone Lord Warringham may not have expected at the hour he died. Someone who might have come through this very stairwell." Lestrade was already scribbling. "I'll have a man sent to the address." "No," Holmes said. "We shall go ourselves." "Now? Time, Lestrade," Holmes said as he descended the stairs, "is the very essence of this affair. And in this case, it stopped at 10:43, for a reason we have not yet grasped." He paused at the bottom step, his face illuminated briefly by the glow of a gas lamp. "I intend to discover precisely what betrayed Lord Warringham, whether it was blood, trust, or time itself." Without waiting for reply, he strode out into the fog once more, the mystery deepening with every step we took away from the scene of the crime and toward the stranger who might hold its key. The address on the envelope was written in a fine, deliberate hand. Miss A. Mortimer, 3 Tolland Street, Mayfair. Holmes carried it in his gloved hand as we left Warringham House, glancing at it periodically as though he expected the ink to reveal more than it had. The fog had thickened by the time we hailed another cab, and I watched him through the lantern-lit murk, noting the way his brows had drawn together in that hawkish furrow which always preceded revelation. "Miss Mortimer is not merely a social acquaintance," he said at last, breaking the silence as the wheels rumbled across cobbles slick with mist. No mention of her from the widow, yet a letter addressed in Lord Warringham's personal hand, hidden among ledgers rather than in a correspondence box. A woman hidden is a woman significant. And yet she may simply be a friend, I offered. Or even, "Watson, there is no simply in murder," Holmes snapped, though not unkindly. "Warringham feared something the night he died. I wager this woman is tied to it. Whether by design or proximity remains to be seen." The cab deposited us in a narrow Mayfair street lined with modest but respectable townhouses. Number 3 bore no nameplate, but its windows glowed with a soft amber light. Holmes knocked twice. Sharply. It was answered not by a servant, but by the lady herself. Miss Mortimer was perhaps 30, plain in dress but striking in countenance. Her eyes were the sort that saw more than they revealed. She took in Holmes and myself in an instant, and though her posture stiffened slightly, she did not retreat. "I was expecting someone else," she said. Holmes bowed. "Then I regret to disappoint. Sherlock Holmes, this is Dr. Watson, may we come in?" Something flickered across her face. Recognition, resignation, I could not tell. But she opened the door wider. The sitting room was small but orderly, with shelves of books and a piano in the corner whose keys bore recent polish. A kettle hissed on the hob, and the faint smell of lavender suggested more comfort than indulgence. She gestured for us to sit. "You're here about Lord Warringham?" Holmes inclined his head. "You speak plainly, Miss Mortimer. That's refreshing." "I find lies waste everyone's time." She settled across from us. "Yes, I knew him. And no, I didn't kill him." "Why not begin," Holmes said softly, "with why he wrote to you?" A silence stretched between them. Finally, she folded her hands. "Because he was afraid." He didn't say it aloud, but I knew. "He visited me last week. Said he'd done something years ago that someone was now using against him. That a mistake had returned to demand payment." "What kind of mistake?" I asked. She hesitated. "That, he didn't tell me. Only that he thought it might ruin his name, his family's honor. He said he had until the end of the month to make it right." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "He referred to R in his notebook. Might that be Robert Claythorne?" I doubt it. Robert was part of the estate. Nothing more. "No, I think R referred to someone else. Someone who had something over him." "And you?" Holmes asked. "What were you to him?" Miss Mortimer's eyes did not flinch. "We were friends. In a way polite society wouldn't approve. He visited me often, trusted me, confided in me things he couldn't say to his wife." "And did you see him the night he died?" Number 1 hadn't seen him since Monday. She paused. "He said he'd bring the proof. I don't know what it was, but he promised I'd understand everything when I saw it." Holmes nodded slowly, then stood. "If I might impose further, I would like to examine any correspondence he left with you, or anything sent since his death." She looked at him, long and level, then crossed the room to a locked drawer. From it, she drew a sealed envelope and handed it over. "He left this with me. Said I was to read it if anything happened. I haven't." Holmes turned it over in his hands. There was no address, only a wax seal and a single word written in ink: amends. "I shall return it to you," he said. "No," she said quietly. "Keep it. If you're the only one trying to find out the truth, then it belongs with you." Back in the cab, Holmes broke the seal with a flick of his thumb. The letter inside was brief but disturbing. "To whom it may concern, if I am dead, then it is because of what I allowed to remain hidden. Years ago, I made an error of judgment, one which cost a man his freedom and another his dignity. I thought it buried, but someone has found it. A watch was taken then. It has returned, and so has the man it belonged to. If this is revenge, I deserve it, but I fear it will not end with me. A.M. I am sorry. I should never have let it reach you. P.W. I read it twice over his shoulder. A man wronged, a watch stolen, and now returned. Holmes nodded, folding the letter. There is a missing piece yet, but we are closer. This was not merely murder, it was punishment, and the object that links both past and present is the watch, but not the one found in his hand. That was a decoy. You believe the true killer is the owner of the original watch? Yes, and I think he placed it in Lord Warringham's study, or returned it somehow, to remind him of his guilt, and then destroyed it. Holmes shook his head. No, Watson. Someone else destroyed it. Someone who wanted the message hidden. Someone who knew what that watch meant. You suspect Lady Warringham. I do not suspect. I consider possibilities. But she omitted much in our first meeting. Too much. And now it is time to see what else she has kept from us. We returned to Warringham House under cover of early evening. The fog had thickened still, curling like ghostly fingers around the gates. Lestrade was waiting just inside the foyer. Well, he asked. Anything from the Mortimer woman? Holmes handed him the letter without a word. Lestrade read it with pursed lips. I don't like it, he muttered. Makes it all too personal. Revenge makes men clever. Indeed, Holmes replied. And women too. Tell me, has Lady Warringham remained in her rooms? She's been with the family solicitor most of the afternoon. I believe they just finished. Then let us speak to her. It's time she knew we are not in pursuit of scandal, but truth. Lady Warringham received us in the morning room, still dressed in morning black, but with an expression far more composed than grief would suggest. Holmes did not sit. He stood before her, hands behind his back. Lady Warringham, I must ask you plainly. Did you know of your husband's affair with Miss Mortimer? She stared at him, blinking once. Affair. Number I suspected he was keeping something, yes, but not her. Then you did not destroy the watch in the fireplace? She frowned. What watch? The one your husband feared would expose him, the one that linked him to a betrayal. Her face went pale, and a silence settled over the room. But she said nothing. Holmes gave her one final searching look. Then I suggest you begin remembering what else you have failed to say, before someone else decides silence is no longer sufficient. We stepped out once again into the London fog, the letter still folded in Holmes' coat pocket, the truth pressing closer like the narrowing walls of some invisible trap. We're near the center now, Watson, Holmes murmured. We have the watch, the woman, the warning. All that remains is the man, the one who was betrayed. Holmes' mood had shifted by the time we reached Baker Street. He discarded his coat with irritation and lit his pipe in silence, pacing before the hearth like a predator too long denied its prey. The fog clung to the window panes, and even the familiar comfort of our lodgings could not dispel the sensation that we were circling something far more dangerous than revenge or inheritance. It is not the betrayal itself that interests me, Watson, Holmes said at last, between drags of tobacco, but the precision of its execution. Everything about this case is meticulous, down to the placement of a broken watch. Our adversary is not reckless. He has waited years. He halted, turning abruptly. Fetch me the Times archives from last year, the October folios. No, begin with September. There was something about a prison release, an unusual parole. I obliged, retrieving the bound volumes from our cabinet, and together we pored over pages thick with parliamentary squabbles, shipping announcements, and the steady drone of society's misfortunes. At last, in the September 18th issue, Holmes tapped the page with sudden satisfaction. There, Pentonville Prison releases Edward Venn after 15 years, sentence commuted due to failing health. Venn, a former clerk in the Colonial Office, was convicted in 1884 for embezzlement and forgery. His conviction was based on evidence provided by Lord Percival Warringham, then Under Secretary for Colonial Affairs. Edward Venn, Holmes said, voice tight with purpose. 15 years. The timeline fits. He was betrayed, Watson, likely framed. And now he's returned. What did Warringham say in his letter? A man lost his freedom, another his dignity. Venn is the former. Who is the latter? I scanned the article. No mention of accomplices. Holmes stood and reached for his coat again. Then we asked the man himself. He's staying at a hospital on the East End under supervision. Come, Watson, we'll question a ghost returned from the dead. By the time we reached the East London infirmary, the fog had lifted slightly, though the chill remained, wrapping the city in a grey pall. The hospital was a soot-streaked edifice of stone and iron, reeking of antiseptic and overuse. We were directed by a young nurse to a private room on the second floor where Holmes entered without knocking. The man in the bed looked like one grown from shadow. Thin, papery skin clung to his cheeks, and his eyes were dull with the weight of years. But when Holmes spoke his name, Edward Venn's gaze flickered alive. "I thought it might be you," he said hoarsely. "The famous detective." Holmes inclined his head. "You were released 3 months ago. You've not once spoken of Lord Warringham in public, and yet he died a week ago under suspicious circumstances. You must understand the appearance." Venn chuckled, dry and low. "Appearances? Yes. They used those to hang me once." "Did you kill him?" "No." "Did you threaten to?" "No." Holmes took a step forward. "He believed you would. He wrote to a woman, Miss Mortimer, warning her that your return meant danger." Venn's smile faded. "He was always afraid of ghosts, even the ones he made." "And the watch?" Holmes asked. "The one stolen when you were arrested. Did you get it back?" Venn blinked slowly, and something deep in his expression changed. "It was all I had. A gift from my father. He took it, said it would go missing in inventory, that it was a price I had to pay. Then you retrieved it recently?" "I didn't need to," Venn whispered. "It was sent to me, arrived 2 weeks after my release." No note. Just the watch, restored, polished, ticking. Holmes froze. "You're certain it was yours?" "I would know it anywhere." "And you didn't send it to Warringham?" Venn shook his head. "Why would I return a ghost to a murderer?" We left the infirmary in silence. Holmes moving with a rigidity I'd come to recognize as his signal state of deduction. Not frenzied, not abstract, just cold, crystalline calculation. "He's telling the truth," Holmes murmured as we turned down Whitechapel Road. "He was framed, yes, but not by Warringham alone. There's another. The second man. Indeed, the man who took the watch and knew its value, the one who has remained invisible until now. But if Venn didn't return the watch, who did? That, Watson, is the question, and I believe we've already met them." Back at Baker Street, Holmes spread his notes across the desk. Letters, timelines, the prison article, and the mysterious phrase from Warringham's letter. "It will not end with me. You see, Watson," Holmes said, drawing 2 columns. "Venn is the victim, not the killer. Warringham, perhaps, sought to atone, but too late. The missing watch was not returned to hurt him, but to remind him. It was a summons, and once he understood the implications, he tried to destroy it, but someone else got there first. Claythorne? Holmes shook his head. Too obvious. And Lady Warringham is frightened, but not murderous. Number, we must consider who benefits now, not then. I frowned. The estate, the inheritance. Exactly, Holmes said, and jabbed his pen at the second column. The solicitor, Mr. James Holcombe. The solicitor. Who would know both the details of Warringham's estate and the means of his disgrace? Who would have access to the letters, the records, the legal machinery behind his downfall? A man who could have helped frame Venn in 1884 and who now stands to gain power, leverage, or influence by the reshuffling of titles and funds. But would a solicitor kill for that? Holmes smiled thinly. A solicitor might not, but a man betrayed by a friend who helped orchestrate that betrayal to his own benefit, he might, especially if he feared exposure. He seized his coat again. Where are we going now? I asked. To confront Mr. Holcombe. The solicitor's office was located near Temple Bar, a small suite nestled behind a discreet brass plate. When we arrived, Holcombe was seated at a massive desk, writing in a ledger with a methodical hand. He looked up with only mild surprise. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, to what do I owe the visit? Holmes did not sit. He produced the scorched remains of the watch from his pocket and placed it gently on the desk. You recognize this? Holcombe blinked. Should I? It was taken from Lord Warringham's fireplace. The second watch, destroyed to conceal the first. The original was returned to him shortly before his death. You were in his house the next day to collect estate documents. Did you find the watch then? Or was it delivered to you from someone else? Edward Venn, perhaps? Holcombe stared at him. You're speaking in riddles. No, I'm speaking in truth. In 1884, you were his clerk. You arranged the paper trail that ruined Venn, and you kept the watch, Venn's watch, as your insurance. When Venn was released, you feared he'd speak, so you returned it to Warringham as a warning. Holcombe's jaw tightened. That's preposterous. Is it? Holmes said softly. You see, I wrote to Pentonville's warden. The inventory list from Venn's arrest shows the watch was never recorded. It vanished after the warrant was signed by your hand. Silence. Then, very softly, Holcombe said, he wasn't supposed to die. But he did, Holmes said. And you were there after? You moved the body, planted the decoy watch, and burned the real one to sever the past. You killed him to protect your name. Holcombe looked at the ruined watch again, just once, and then said nothing. Holmes turned to Lestrade, who had waited silently in the doorway. Inspector, he said, you may arrest Mr. Holcombe for the murder of Lord Percival Warringham. As the constables entered, Holmes turned and walked out, his voice low enough only for me to hear. It was not the stopped watch that betrayed him, Watson. It was the man who tried to wind it back. The arrest of James Holcombe was conducted without spectacle, though not without tension. As Lestrade and his men led the solicitor from his office in Temple Bar, the man's shoulders remained squared and his lips pressed into a tight, defiant line. It was the look of a man who had built a fortress out of paperwork and reputation, and who now saw it crumble, not with scandal, but with fact. Holmes observed it all in silence, hands behind his back, and when the door to Holcombe's office finally clicked shut behind us, he let out a long, satisfied breath. Curious, he murmured, as we stepped out into the evening mist. One can spend a lifetime among ledgers and clients, yet still believe that truth is a negotiable instrument. But truth, Watson, truth is an invoice that always demands payment. We walked a few paces before I broke the silence. Do you think he'll confess? Eventually, Holmes said. He's too methodical not to. He'll attempt to barter, mitigating circumstances, claims of remorse. But the chain of logic is ironclad. The inventory from Pentonville, the unrecorded disappearance of the watch, the fire in Warringham's study, the real time of death, each a rivet. He cannot escape it. We returned to Baker Street for a late supper, which Mrs. Hudson had thoughtfully laid out, though Holmes barely touched his plate. He stood at the window, arms folded, pipe clenched in his teeth, watching the darkened street as though expecting it to offer some final piece of the puzzle. "But something remains," he muttered, "a trace of smoke on a cleanly swept hearth." I looked up from my plate. "What do you mean?" "Warringham's letter," he said. "He wrote that he feared something which would not end with him. If Holcomb intended to kill simply for self-preservation, why allow the letter to survive? Why not destroy all evidence of a conspiracy?" I set my fork down. "You think there's another party still involved?" Holmes nodded. "Someone who knew the letter existed, perhaps even facilitated its delivery. Someone who wanted the warning to be preserved." "Miss Mortimer?" He didn't answer immediately, which for Holmes was answer enough. "Tomorrow," he said finally, "we return to Tolland Street. There is something she has not yet told us." Miss Mortimer received us without surprise, as though she had been expecting Holmes to return. Her sitting room remained unchanged, the lavender scent still lingering, the piano untouched. She poured tea with steady hands and gestured for us to sit, but Holmes did not. "Miss Mortimer," he said quietly, "Warringham's death was orchestrated not solely by Holcomb, but by something deeper. A reckoning. You were close to him, closer than society would have tolerated. He trusted you. Did he trust you enough to tell you everything?" Her lips compressed, but she did not flinch. "I knew the truth about Venn. He told me weeks before he died that he had helped Holcomb falsify evidence, that he had benefited from the arrangement. And yet you did nothing." "I tried to convince him to come forward, but he was afraid, said it would ruin the family name, that the Honorable Lord Warringham couldn't admit to being a coward." Holmes stepped closer. "Then why did you not bring this information to the police after his death?" Her gaze met his squarely. "Because I thought I could handle it myself. I thought I could confront Holcomb, warn him that I knew. I never expected—" Her voice faltered. She looked down at her hands. "I never expected him to act first." There was a pause. Holmes stared at her for a long time. "You confronted Holcomb before the murder?" "I sent him an anonymous note, told him I knew about the watch, that it had been returned. I never signed it. I only wanted to frighten him. I thought if he believed the past was coming back, he'd confess." Holmes's expression darkened. "You precipitated the crime." She nodded miserably. "Unintentionally." Holmes resumed pacing. "And the letter from Warringham, was it delivered before or after his death?" "Before. He sent it by private messenger 2 days earlier. I only read it after you showed it to me." Holmes turned back. "Then you did not destroy the watch?" "Number 1 never saw it." There was silence. Then Holmes asked, "One final question, Miss Mortimer. Where were you the night Lord Warringham died?" She blinked. "I was here, alone." He nodded, as though confirming a fact already known. "Thank you." As we descended the steps from her flat, I turned to Holmes. "She wasn't lying." "No," he said, "but she was mistaken." "Mistaken?" "She believes Holcomb killed Warringham out of panic because of her letter, but the timeline is wrong. Holcomb was not aware the watch had been returned. He only discovered it after the murder, when it had already been burned." "Then why kill him?" Holmes turned to me on the landing. "Because someone else was threatening Holcomb, someone who stood to benefit from his downfall. The watch was not returned to Warringham as a threat, it was planted. Not by Venn, not by Miss Mortimer, but by a third party." He paused. "Tell me, Watson, who knew of the affair? Who had access to the household?" Who stood to inherit if Warringham and Claythorne were removed from the line of succession? I stared at him. "Good Lord," I whispered. "Lady Warringham?" Holmes smiled grimly. She was the one person who knew about the affair but pretended otherwise. She knew her husband had grown distant, even guilty, and she knew Claythorne had debts. One was vulnerable, the other careless. Eliminate both, and the estate reverts to her fully and without contest. But she seemed so reserved. Reserved women often make the most calculating avengers. Holmes hailed a cab at the corner. "To Warringham House." "It's time we asked Lady Warringham what she was doing at 10:43 p.m. Lady Warringham was in the solarium, seated beside a withering orchid and a tray of untouched tea. She received us with a faint nod, but her eyes gave nothing. "Mr. Holmes," she said, "I assume your presence here means the matter is not yet resolved." "On the contrary," Holmes replied, "I believe it is." He stood before her, unflinching. "The watch was returned to your husband as a message, but not by Edward Venn. It was delivered by you. You intercepted it before it reached him and planted it in his study. You wanted him to suffer, didn't you? To feel the weight of his sins. But you didn't expect him to act. When he began writing letters, preparing to confess, you panicked." Her voice was ice. "You have no proof." Holmes reached into his coat and removed a single sheet of paper. "The jeweler's receipt for a restored timepiece, Edward Venn's, unmistakable from the serial number. Paid for in cash by a woman matching your description. Collected days before the murder." Lady Warringham's face did not change, but something behind her eyes cracked. "You had access to the hidden staircase," Holmes continued. "You waited until the house slept. You entered the study and found him with the pistol. Whether he was preparing to use it or merely contemplating, you acted. You took the opportunity, turned suicide into certainty. You shot him in the head, placed the pistol in his right hand, and locked the door behind you. Then you returned to your room. Why? It was I who asked it, unable to stop myself." Lady Warringham rose slowly, smoothing her skirts with trembling fingers. "Because he chose her. Because he betrayed our vows, our name, and when he could no longer carry the burden of what he'd done, he turned to her instead of me." She looked Holmes in the eye. "I gave him a chance. The watch was not a threat, it was a mercy. A reminder to tell the truth, but he didn't. He wrote letters, coward's letters, and in the end, I finished what he couldn't." Holmes nodded, as if he had been waiting all along for the admission. Lestrade stepped from behind the garden wall. "You heard enough?" "Plenty," the inspector said grimly. Lady Warringham said nothing more as the constables escorted her from the solarium, her footsteps light on the marble floor. As the sun broke faintly through the clouds, Holmes turned to me. "Even a stopped watch," he said softly, "is right twice a day, but in this case, it marked not the time of death, but the moment of betrayal." The early afternoon light filtering into 221B Baker Street the following day did little to warm the room, nor to shift Holmes from his familiar corner by the hearth, where he had spent the past hour with his eyes half closed and his fingers pressed together beneath his chin. The case had ostensibly concluded. Lady Warringham had confessed, Lestrade had taken her into custody, and the newspapers were already composing tidy headlines about tragedy and scandal behind Mayfair's stone facades. And yet, Holmes was not satisfied. "Holcomb's guilt," he said abruptly, "is a fact, but not the whole fact." I looked up from the Morning Post, which had dedicated 2 full columns to the Mayfair murder and the man in the ashes. "You believe there's more?" "I know there's more," Holmes said sharply. "The timeline is still too strained. Lady Warringham delivered the watch, yes. She confronted her husband, perhaps even killed him. But someone else burned the watch afterward. Someone who had no intention of letting the world know what it was." "But why?" I asked. She'd already confessed. "What motive remains?" Holmes gave me a sidelong glance. A confession is not necessarily the truth, Watson. Sometimes it is merely the most convenient exit. I stared at him. You think she's innocent? I think she's guilty. Of hatred, and perhaps of cruelty, but not of murder. Not directly, not physically. Consider it. She had opportunity, yes. But would she risk sneaking through the servants' passage, handling a firearm, setting a scene with such precision? Number that reeks of another hand, one who helped her, perhaps without her full understanding. He stood abruptly. We returned to Warringham House, but to what end? To ask one final question, he said, of the man who heard the shot and did nothing, Frederick Grimes, the valet. The servants' quarters at Warringham House had grown even quieter in the days following Lady Warringham's arrest. Holmes and I were ushered in by the butler, who now carried the gaunt, hesitant manner of a man unsure who truly governed the household. Grimes was found in the scullery, polishing a line of silver forks with mechanical precision. He stood when we entered, wiping his hands on his apron. You again, he said to Holmes, but there was no rancor in his tone, only fatigue. Indeed, Holmes replied. You said last time that you brought Lord Warringham tea at 10 o'clock, that you heard a shot before midnight and forced the door open with the butler. All true? Grimes gave a slow nod. Holmes stepped closer, but it was not the first shot you heard that evening, was it? The man flinched. I don't follow. I think you do. A suppressed report. A crack rather than a bang. Around 10:43. You heard it but dismissed it, or perhaps were told to dismiss it, by someone you trusted, someone who paid you to say otherwise. Grimes stood frozen, eyes darting. No, there was no other. Holmes pulled a small notebook from his coat pocket and opened it. The estate ledgers, the household accounts show a withdrawal. 40 guineas, cash, delivered to you the morning after Lord Warringham's death. A gift, was it? Grimes' voice was a whisper. She said it was to keep the household quiet, to protect the family name. She, I asked. Grimes nodded. Lady Warringham, she told me to say the shot came later, that he'd locked the door, that it must have been suicide. She was pale, shaken. I thought she'd seen something. I didn't know she... Holmes raised a hand. She didn't kill him. She found him after he'd been shot. What you heard at 10:43 was the true moment of death. She arrived later and staged the rest. But someone else killed him, someone with the key to the study and a reason to make it look like suicide. Grimes looked down at the polished silver. Who else had that key? Holmes asked. The valet hesitated. Then quietly, he said, Mr. Claythorne. Robert Claythorne greeted us in the drawing room with visible irritation and a brandy already half consumed. More questions, he slurred. I thought you'd hounded every ghost from these halls already. Holmes remained standing. You were in the house the night Lord Warringham died. You claim you left before 9. Your club says you arrived just past 11. Claythorne waved a dismissive hand. I had a walk. Cleared my head. You had a walk to the study, Holmes said. You had a key, you had debts, and you knew the value of that watch. You found it on his desk and recognized what it meant. Claythorne's eyes narrowed. You've got nothing. Holmes moved closer. On the contrary, you were wearing leather boots with a worn left heel. Your shoes left the scuff by the window, and you were in the room at 10:43. Grimes heard the shot. He didn't say anything because Lady Warringham paid him to protect the story, but she didn't shoot him. There was a long silence. Then Claythorne laughed bitterly. So now it's my turn, is it? You've blamed the widow, the solicitor, even that wretched girl, Mortimer. Why not the black sheep cousin? Because, Holmes said coldly, you are not the black sheep. You were the heir. You stood to inherit the estate if Warringham were gone. But once Holcomb manipulated the will to favor a charitable trust, your inheritance vanished. Claythorne blinked. "Ah," Holmes said. "So you didn't know? Then I was wrong. You're not the killer, just the fool." Claythorne bristled. "Who then?" "Holcomb's in prison," my aunt confessed. Holmes turned to me. "Watson, whom have we overlooked?" I frowned. "We've spoken to Venn, Mortimer, Claythorne, Holcomb, and Lady Warringham." Holmes raised a brow. "Grimes?" "Too timid." "Then who?" Suddenly, it clicked. The butler. Holmes smiled. "Precisely. The only man who remained in the background. He unlocked the door after the death. He had access to the keys, and he was the one who retrieved the burnt watch from the grate and disposed of it. Quietly. Efficiently. But why?" I asked. Holmes turned back to Claythorne. "Because he was Warringham's half-brother, born of a housemaid, hidden, discarded, but still living in the household, watching as the family he was denied paraded their power and wealth. I discovered the record in the hospital files. His mother's name was Jane Warren. She died in childbirth. Warringham was 17. Claythorne paled. "He served in this house for decades." "He waited," Holmes said. "And when Venn's watch returned, he saw his chance. He murdered Warringham, staged the suicide, and left the evidence where Lady Warringham would find it. She, believing herself guilty, fabricated a cover story to protect the family name." Claythorne stumbled through the middle of it. "Holcomb, ever the coward, tried to destroy the trail, but it all began with the man who opened the door." Holmes turned away. "I believe you'll find him in the cellar, his room, hidden among his master's secrets." Lestrade's men found him within the hour. He offered no resistance. He simply said, "He called me boy, after all these years. Just boy." And then he was silent. That evening, Holmes sat with me by the fire, a single glass of claret untouched by his chair. "The irony," he said, "is that the one man who waited with patience and subtlety was undone by the one thing he could never control." I nodded. "The watch." "Yes," Holmes said. "Time, betrayal, memory, they all conspire against the dishonest eventually." And he picked up the charred remains of the watch from his desk. "It stopped," he murmured, "at 10:43. But in truth, that was the moment it began ticking once more. For the truth, for justice, for a ghost who refused to be forgotten." He placed it down gently, and with that, the case was closed. The days that followed the final revelation passed with unusual stillness. The newspapers, now glutted with scandal, revised their headlines yet again. Half-brother Butler revealed as Mayfair killer, twisted kinship behind Lord's murder, and Detective Holmes unmasks a family's forgotten son. All of London buzzed with gossip about the Warringham legacy. The noble family undone not by financial ruin or foreign scandal, but by a secret buried beneath their very own roof. At 221B, however, the atmosphere was far from triumphant. Holmes, though vindicated by events, was restless. I found him one morning rearranging the notes from the case on the floor, maps, times, statements, all laid out in precise geometric rows like pieces of a game played too long. "It is done, Holmes," I said as I poured us both a cup of coffee. "The man confessed, Lady Warringham cleared. Holcomb is to be tried for his role. There is nothing more." Holmes did not look up. "And yet, Watson, there remains the one element I cannot explain. The one that lingers, like smoke after fire." I joined him at the hearth. "What are you referring to?" He gestured to a page, Warringham's letter to Miss Mortimer. He said, "It will not end with me." I was content for a time to interpret that as poetic remorse. But now, I wonder. "You suspect another layer still?" Holmes's fingers tapped lightly against his lips. "The butler, Reynolds, is not a man of chaos. He did not act out of sudden rage. His life was one of observation, not action. For him to plan a murder so exacting, so symbolic, suggests not desperation, but encouragement. Someone urged him. Someone turned resentment into resolve. I blinked. You think he had an accomplice? I think someone wanted the old lord dead and used Reynolds as the blade. It was a chilling thought. The case had already waded through layers of deception. What remained now but shadows? Holmes gathered the notes, folded them, and locked them in his desk. We're going back to Warringham House, he said. I stood. For what purpose now? Holmes glanced toward the window, where the pale morning sun had just begun to burn through the London haze, to see what he left behind. We arrived unannounced. The house was now in the stewardship of the executors. The staff dispersed or dismissed. The once stately home felt hollow, a husk of itself. We were admitted by a clerk managing the inventory, a nervous man more focused on ledgers than memory. Holmes ignored him and led me not to the study, but to the cellar. It is often the case, Watson, he said as we descended, that a man's true nature is revealed not where he hosts guests, but where he hides his past. Reynolds' small room was as austere as one might expect. Cot, wash basin, trunk. Holmes opened the latter carefully and began to sift through its contents. A few worn books, a small stack of letters, a carved wooden box. And then he found it. A bundle of envelopes, worn, opened, resealed with care. Correspondence, Holmes murmured, from someone. He flipped through them, one by one, pausing now and again, lips pressed tight. At last he selected one and handed it to me. It was written in a feminine hand. Ah, he has not changed. He will not. He is still blind to what he took. But if you act, you must act with care. Let the past speak for itself. The watch is ready. Place it where he cannot ignore it. Once he sees, he will understand. The rest is up to you. A.M. Miss Mortimer, I breathed. Holmes nodded. Not an accomplice in the murder, but a co-conspirator in the catalyst. She gave Reynolds the final push. She set the events in motion, not to kill, perhaps, but to force confrontation. But she claimed she only sent an anonymous note to Holcomb. She lied, Holmes said calmly. To protect herself. She placed the watch. She and Reynolds plotted the exposure, not murder. But they must have known what might happen. I stared at the letter. So she used Reynolds, told him to confront his half-brother with the symbol of betrayal. The watch. Holmes stood. And Reynolds, full of long-festered resentment, took the symbolic and made it literal. We returned to Baker Street as the afternoon deepened, the streets turning once again to their familiar bustle. Holmes said nothing until we were once more before the fire, the envelope between us on the table. So what now? I asked. Holmes looked at me with something close to weariness. Now, nothing. Nothing? She did not kill him. She did not even tell Reynolds to kill him. Her letter, though dangerous, was not criminal. She believed it would spur a confession, or at worst, a scandal. And in that, she was naive, but not murderous. He tapped the envelope. We've seen what vengeance looks like, Watson. This was something colder, a chess move. I was silent for a time. Then I said, she played God with another man's anger. Yes, Holmes agreed. And the result was death. It was not until 3 days later that we saw Miss Mortimer again. She arrived at Baker Street just past dusk, wearing a veil and a coat buttoned tight at the throat. Holmes greeted her without surprise and invited her to sit. She declined. I know why you've called me, she said. I didn't. Then you found the letter. He inclined his head slightly. She stood silent for a moment, then said, I never wanted him dead. I believe you, Holmes replied, but you played with fire. You gave a wounded man the symbol of his betrayal and left him to interpret it alone. I wanted justice, she said, almost to herself. No, Holmes corrected gently. You wanted an ending. Justice belongs to the living. You sought something for the dead. Tears shimmered behind her veil, though she did not let them fall. Holmes leaned forward. I will not go to Lestrade, but I will tell you this. Should you again choose to tip the scales of another man's fate, I will not stand idle. She nodded once, then turned and left. The door clicked softly shut behind her. That night, Holmes took the remains of the watch, scorched and broken, and placed it carefully in a small velvet pouch. He did not say where he intended to send it, but I did not ask. Some truths, I had learned, are best left between ghosts, and in the flickering gaslight of our sitting room, I realized that the true betrayal in this case was not between brothers or lovers or even colleagues. It was the betrayal of time itself. Each man believed he had more of it, and when the moment struck, when the watch stopped at 10:43, it had already chosen its side. Holmes smoked late into the night, the smoke curling upwards like memory, and I sat beside him, pen in hand, writing the final lines of a case I knew I would never fully understand. But Holmes had understood it, as he always did. The autumn dusk settled across Baker Street with a kind of theatrical finality, as though the sky itself sought to draw curtains on the grim play that had unfolded across these past weeks. I had long since set aside my pen for the evening, but Holmes remained wakeful and intense, seated at his desk with the final pieces of the case laid before him. Reynolds' confession, the scorched remains of the watch, and the letter penned by Miss Mortimer in a delicate, unforgiving script. "Have you noticed, Watson," he said without looking up, "how often justice arrives through the wrong door?" I glanced at him over my cup of tea. In this case, I'd say it arrived through several doors, and most of them were locked. Holmes gave a faint smile. Indeed, but it was not the butler's crime alone, nor was it Lady Warringham's cruelty, nor even Holcomb's old cowardice that sealed the fate of Lord Warringham. It was all of them, each playing their role in a slow tragedy no one had the courage to stop. He stood and moved to the window. Outside, gas lamps flickered through a light rain, giving the street the look of a dream half remembered. "And now it concludes," I said quietly. Holmes turned toward me. "No, Watson, it does not." I looked at him sharply. "You mean there's more?" Holmes paced slowly. "We have accounted for motive, opportunity, even collusion. But one detail still troubles me, and I find myself unable to rest until I resolve it." I set down my cup. "Which detail?" Holmes raised a brow. "The envelope." He returned to his desk and drew forth the letter that had been recovered from Miss Mortimer's home, the one Lord Warringham had sent her before his death. "You recall the seal. It was unbroken when we arrived. She claimed she had not opened it." "Yes." Holmes held it up in the firelight. "But this seal is not the one used by Warringham in any of his official correspondence, nor is it the one used on his private stationery, which bears a stylized W. This seal was unfamiliar to me at the Tihar time, but I've since matched it." He retrieved another object from the drawer, a red wax impression taken from a different envelope. "Here," he said, "is the seal used by the Trust, the legal charity Holcomb created under Warringham's name. It bears a symbol, a tree within a broken circle. This seal was used to send correspondence from the Trust's founding body." I frowned. "You're suggesting the letter to Miss Mortimer was intercepted or forged?" "I am suggesting," Holmes said, "that the letter she read was not the letter he sent." My blood chilled. "But then, what was the real letter?" Holmes sat once more, his hands steepled. "That, Watson, is what I intend to discover, and I know precisely where to look." The legal office of James Holcombe had been shuttered following his arrest, but Holmes had obtained permission from Lestrade to examine his archives. We returned there that evening with a lamp, a key, and Holmes's relentless precision. In the back room, where ledgers and deeds were stored in towering cabinets, Holmes made straight for a file marked Charitable Correspondence. He rifled through folders until he drew out one labeled A. Mortimer. Inside was a copy of a letter, typed, dated the morning before Warringham's death. Holmes handed it to me. "My dear A, I am told you are no longer content to remain quiet. You must understand what exposure would do, not just to me, but to all those attached to my name. You were once a friend. Do not become a danger. If you act, I shall be forced to act in turn. P.W." I stared at the page. This isn't remorse. It's a threat. Holmes nodded grimly. A fabrication. I compared it to known samples of Lord Warringham's writing. The typewriter used here does not match any he owned, but it does match the model in Holcombe's office. He sent this letter, using Warringham's name, intended to provoke Miss Mortimer, to make her feel endangered, to manipulate her actions. I sat heavily in the chair. Then she never received the real letter? Holmes opened a second drawer and removed a sealed envelope. This one bore the true Warringham seal. The wax had not been broken. I found this in Holcombe's effects. It was never sent. He intercepted it. Holmes broke the seal and unfolded the page. He read aloud. "My dearest A, I have done wrong. I do not ask your forgiveness, but I must unburden the truth. I have begun the process of dissolving the trust and arranging restitution for Venn. Holcombe will resist me. He knows too much, and I fear he will act to protect himself. If anything happens to me, know that I tried, too late perhaps, to undo what I allowed. Tell them the truth. Let it be known. Percival." A long silence followed. Then Holmes whispered. He was not running from guilt. He was walking toward redemption. I exhaled slowly, and Holcombe could not allow it. Holmes folded the letter carefully. "This, Watson, is the final truth. Warringham did not fear exposure. He feared interference. He feared that the same man who had betrayed him once would betray him again. And he was right." We delivered the letter to Lestrade that same evening. Though Holcombe was already under arrest, the new evidence clarified his role beyond any ambiguity. His fabricated threats to Miss Mortimer had tipped the delicate scale of vengeance toward disaster. With this letter, her name would be fully cleared, and Warringham's final intent, at last, known. The following day, we received an unannounced visitor, Miss Mortimer. She entered quietly, bearing a small package wrapped in cloth. She placed it gently on Holmes's desk. "I had it hidden," she said. "The watch. The original. I found it in Reynolds' room the day after his arrest. I knew what it meant. I knew what it cost. I couldn't look at it. Not until I knew what he truly meant to say." Holmes unwrapped it carefully. The timepiece lay in his palm, gold, elegant, unmistakably old. The hour hand was frozen between 10 and 11, the minute hand precisely at 43. He wound it gently. It began to tick again. Miss Mortimer did not speak again. She only nodded once with tears she did not allow to fall, and then quietly departed. We watched her go in silence. That night, Holmes placed the restored watch on the mantel. "It is strange," he said, "how a man's redemption can be written in seconds. He tried, Watson. He tried." I sat beside him, pen in hand once more. "Will you keep it?" "No," Holmes replied. "It belongs to Miss Mortimer, or perhaps to no one now. Its time has been paid for." He leaned back in his chair, gazing at the fire. "And so ends a case not of murder," he said softly, "but of mercy denied. truth delayed, and time betrayed. And though the ticking of the watch was faint, I heard it, as if the very room itself now kept time not with hours, but with memory. The final days of the case drifted into memory like smoke curling upward from a long doused fire, persistent in scent, but no longer stinging the eyes. The watch, once a relic of betrayal, had been returned to Miss Mortimer, who accepted it without ceremony. She did not linger. We never saw her again. Holmes, for his part, moved on as he always did. Though the case had stirred something deep within him, something I could not quite name, he made no admission of it. He turned once more to the violin, practiced chemical experiments in the early hours, and consulted on a forgery trial in Bristol without ever mentioning Lord Warringham, Holcombe, or the man called Reynolds again. Yet I could not let it go so easily, perhaps because I had seen, in this case more than others, the full scope of human folly. Pride, revenge, secrecy, guilt, and that slow erosion of dignity which comes not from evil, but from silence. One evening, nearly a week after the final arrest, and with the fog once again laying its pale shawl across the windows of 221B, I found Holmes sitting alone, a book open but unread in his lap. He looked up when I entered, his gaze sharp despite the quiet. "You are still troubled, Watson?" "Yes," I admitted, though not by the crime itself. "Then by what?" I sat across from him. By how easily it all might have been prevented. If Warringham had confessed sooner, if Holcombe had chosen integrity over self-preservation, if Miss Mortimer had trusted the law instead of symbols, if Reynolds had spoken. Holmes gave a faint smile. A chain of ifs rarely binds the world tighter, old friend. Men and women act within the limits of their fear, their shame, and their pride. To expect clarity from those drowning in guilt is to ask the drowning man to describe the shape of the wave. I leaned forward. "But isn't that what we do, Holmes? Try to bring clarity to murk, truth to confusion." He set the book aside. "We do. But there are cases, Watson, in which the truth is not a blade, swift and decisive, but a salve. Slow, painful, and with no guarantee of healing." I nodded. "Still, I wonder what became of Reynolds. His crime was cold, but not without reason. I suppose the courts will offer no mercy." Holmes stood, moving to the fireplace. "They will consider his age, his service, and the circumstances. But murder remains murder, however justified one may believe it." He stared into the flames for a long moment. "I wrote to the judge overseeing the inquiry," he said softly. "Not to plead, but to clarify. Sometimes the truth of a man's life is not found in what he did, but in what he endured." That, more than any deduction he had made during the case, astonished me. "You advocated for him?" "I informed the court that Lord Warringham was already a dying man," Holmes said. "That the blow was fatal, but symbolic. The bullet that struck him had been years in the chamber. Reynolds simply pulled the trigger." A silence followed. Outside, a carriage rattled by on Baker Street, its wheels whispering against wet cobblestones. At last I said, "And Holcombe?" Holmes returned to his seat. "We'll hang, as he should." His was the mind behind the curtain, the one that ensured Venn's disgrace, that fed the lie, and that intercepted Warringham's confession. He was the architect of silence. And Lady Warringham? "She remains at her country estate," Holmes said. "Retired from society. She will not speak of her husband, and few now ask. I suspect her grief is less for the man than for the myth." "And Miss Mortimer?" Holmes was quiet for a time. "She was the only one who wanted truth, and yet even she lost control of it." I considered that. "Do you believe she loved him?" "I believe she loved who he might have been," Holmes said. "But love, like time, cannot be paused and rewound. When it stops, when it betrays, it leaves only fragments." I rose then to fetch us both a nightcap. As I returned with the glasses, I found Holmes once again turning the scorched remains of the decoy watch between his fingers, the one Reynolds had planted, the false timepiece meant to fool the police. It no longer ticked. He placed it on the mantel beside a book of poetry and a faded photograph of his brother, Mycroft. "Time deceived us all in this case," I said. "No one knew when it would run out." Holmes looked at me. "And yet we measure everything by it." We drank in silence. Then, at length, he said, "There is a reason the hands of a watch always circle back to the same point. Not because time repeats itself, but because men rarely learn in time to change their course." In the weeks that followed, the city turned its attention elsewhere. Another scandal overtook the headlines. The streets grew colder, the fog grew thicker, but the echoes of the case remained in our rooms, quiet, persistent. Now and then, Holmes would glance at the place where the watch had sat, and though he said nothing, I knew he remembered the stillness that followed 10:43 p.m., the moment where choice gave way to consequence. And in my own quiet moments, I would recall Lord Warringham's final letter, sealed and unsent, and wonder how many men carry the truth so close and never dare let it go. On the first clear morning of December, Holmes and I took a walk through Hyde Park. It was cold but dry, the frost still white on the grass. As we neared the Serpentine, Holmes paused and pointed to the water. "Do you see, Watson?" I followed his gaze. The surface was still, reflecting the early light perfectly. But beneath I could see movement. Slow, deliberate, concealed. "Stillness above," he said. "Motion below." That was this case. I nodded. "You see, Watson, everyone believed they understood the surface. Suicide, inheritance, guilt. But underneath, there was another current, and it pulled every one of them down." I shivered, but not from the cold. "Are we finished now?" I asked. He looked at me, and for once there was no jest, no flicker of aloofness in his expression. "Yes," he said. "Now we are finished." And we turned back toward Baker Street as the city stirred awake around us, its clocks ticking, its lives resuming, and its secrets once again tucked away beneath the calm surface of time. Though weeks had passed since the last thread of the case was tied and tucked away in the drawer of Holmes's desk, the echo of its events lingered. In my practice, patients occasionally referred to the Mayfair watch case in hushed tones, while in clubs and drawing rooms, the more cynical gentlemen of London now added Reynolds' name to their whispered lists of fallen men of service. But in our lodgings, the case had become a kind of silence, a shared, unspoken thought that neither Holmes nor I wished to stir. One afternoon, as I returned from a call to Kensington, I found Holmes at his desk studying a single folded letter. It bore no crest, but I recognized the hand. "Miss Mortimer," Holmes said, answering my unspoken question. "It arrived this morning." I said nothing, waiting. "She has left England, gone to the continent, southern France, perhaps. She does not intend to return." He turned the letter over in his hands. "She thanks us, curiously enough, not for justice, but for truth." "A distinction worth making," I said. "Indeed." He placed the letter atop the sealed record of the case, which he had compiled with his usual fastidious care and bound with a narrow red ribbon. It now sat beside Reynolds' final statement, Holcomb's forged correspondence, and the restored watch, returned, finally, to its velvet pouch and stored in the corner drawer of Holmes's bureau. "Do you intend to keep the watch?" I asked. Holmes regarded it for a long time before answering. "Number, its time has ended, and time, when exhausted, must be permitted to rest." He paused, then continued, voice soft but sure. "This case was not a contest of wit, Watson. It was not even a puzzle, in the strictest sense. It was a reckoning. Each man in it faced a mirror. Some shattered it, others turned away. Only Warringham tried to clean the glass and face what he saw. I nodded slowly. But too late. Yes, Holmes said. Too late. We sat in companionable silence, the sort shared only by those who have weathered truths too heavy for easy words. Then, at length, Holmes rose, took the pouch from the drawer, and placed it carefully inside a small wooden box. He addressed the parcel, sealed it, and handed it to me. For Miss Mortimer? For Ven, he replied. The man who lost the most and yet asked for nothing. He should know that the watch ticks once more. And with that, Holmes turned to the fire and took up his violin, drawing from its strings a low, contemplative melody. Neither mournful nor sweet, but precise and steady and true. As the sun dipped beneath the rooftops of Baker Street, I made my notes and closed the final chapter of the affair. It had not ended with a triumph, nor with thunderous applause, but with a clear tolling, like the chime of a clock long neglected, ringing once again for all who cared to hear it. For though the watch had stopped at betrayal, it had not ended in silence. It had, in the end, kept perfect time.